Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video we're going to be doing a little walkthrough for Eden Prime on the Savage difficulty, the first encounter in the first tier of Eden Savage. I'm going to be doing this video in the style kind of like what I did with the Titania walkthrough, where it's very much a non-traditional guide. It's a little bit long-winded, but helps break down how we saw mechanics, how we decided to do them. And as a reminder, this is all week 1 stuff. I fully expect it to get optimized, changed, adjusted, so your party finder may want to do it a different way. Definitely be open to that, adding that little PSA after another video I did recently. And we'll probably be doing these for the majority of the week 1 walkthrough style videos, just so you know as well, because I probably won't have the time nor really usable footage to do it. As you can see, I have like Twitch chat on screen from when this was recorded. I'm actually covering my camera, and there may be like follow or sub pop-ups that use. So it allows me to essentially use footage that I'd otherwise consider unusable for YouTube, just for the sake of a quick explanation, because at the very least, it's quite visible. So for Eden Prime on the Savage difficulty, the A, B, C, D markers, we use those for some of the mechanics, and the setup before the pull was actually very similar to that of what we did for Titania. We essentially set positions using a 1 marker, and we followed those for a majority of mechanics, which I will definitely explain as we go on forward. But just so you know, the A, B, C, and D we use for 4 separate pairs for a separate mechanic, as well as we essentially use delta attack positions for one of the mechanics for a bunch of mechanics as well. But anyway, for this pull, the wall still kills you, and there's not really anything to knock you into the wall. It just kind of kills you for no reason. So just don't touch the wall is essentially all you really need to know about that. Other than that, we actually didn't hit Enrage, but there is an Enrage on this one, unlike normal mode, outside of just the ad phase. So definitely try to kill it as quick as possible. Now, Eden's Gravity, something I didn't really notice when I did the normal mode, is Eden's Gravity actually does a percentage of your max HP as AoE damage. So when we actually get hit by it, if you look over at our health numbers, it actually is absorbable with shields, but the amount of damage that it does will always be an amount based on your max HP. So keep that in mind. If people look like they're relatively healthy, they still might need a little bit of help because of how much damage Eden's Gravity can actually do. After this, the fight kind of has a bunch of stuff from the normal mode, but kind of thrown at you a little bit faster with a little bit less, I guess, notification of it. You'll see these prey-looking markers for the majority of the Vice and Virtue mechanics. And the way you do the mechanics early in the fight changes when you go to do it later in the fight. So if you did normal mode, this first mechanic that's marking the 4 DPS, this is the one that just leaves puddles behind. It works effectively the exact same. We're all just going to drop puddles, and then we're going to go into the boss to dodge Eden's Flare. There's no AoE marker for this stuff, but Eden's Flare in normal mode was just a point-blank AoE. So after you drop those, just get close and don't touch the puddles. Moving forward a little bit more, this is where we get into what I call the triple tank mechanic section, where there's going to be 3 mechanics that we specifically had our tanks be responsible for. The first is going to be a double Vice and Virtue laser, just like normal mode, Spear of Paradise, which we did a tank swap for, and then a prey marker that we had the healers specifically pass on to the tanks. So for this, the Vice and Virtue is just don't have the tanks overlap. Make sure they're mitigating these hits, because everything that is about to hit them is pretty powerful, I'd say. So the 2 lasers here. Now I like to get a little cinematic view is the only reason I'm going over here. There's no reason for anyone to go where I'm going. I just thought it looked really cool for the sake of when I was actually doing progression on the fight, and I didn't need any healing, and there was no buff that I was missing out by not being in the group. But otherwise, there's no reason to do this. So for Spear of Paradise, it is still a 2-hit tank buster like it was in normal mode. However, the first hit will actually put a physical vulnerability up on its current tank. Now, that physical vulnerability up even gets applied if you use tank and vulnerability skills, such as Hallowed Ground. So you're probably going to end up having to do the tank swap here regardless. So we just did a natural tank swap. Both tanks use a defensive cooldown here in order to survive the hit. You can see the first hit and the second hit. And despite looking like a cleave, those are single target hits. So you don't have to worry about both the tanks being in the same spot when they're doing the tank swap right there. Now, for this next one, 2 healers are going to get a marker that they can pass on to nearby party members. All we made sure is that these markers made it to the tanks one way or another. So you'll see right here, the tanks are both in 2 separate positions, and the healers both gave it to the tanks. That's always going to be on both healers, so you can assign which healer gives it to which tank. It will be consistent every time, and there should be no reason to panic. Now, when that wears off, it actually gives them a very powerful bleed, which you just have to make sure they don't die through. Luckily, there's not a whole lot of tank damage for the time being while they're dealing with this bleed, which is why it makes them the best targets to actually take that relatively powerful dot that they're going to be taking. Also, the initial hit actually does a ton of damage, so tanks should mitigate that as well, and then make sure you heal them up through the bleed so that they don't actually die. After that, it's pure light. You know, Eden will teleport to one of the 4 corners. Eden will actually teleport to the farthest corner from where they are currently positioned. So you can actually bait this to be in the same corner every single time. We didn't even bother with that, but we always just had it be in the back of the room, just because Eden was a little bit forward every pull, you know, between A and B is what essentially led to that. But other than that, it's just get behind Eden. There's nothing too special here. Now, this is followed up by a Delta attack. Now, it's exactly the same as the Delta attack in normal, but again, there are 0 AoE markers. So what's essentially happening during Delta attack is Eden is doing an AoE, a point-blank AoE right around them. It's also doing a set of 4 cardinal AoEs, which are going to hit north, south, east, and west in a giant cross. And then all 8 players get a Fire 3 AoE that they need to spread apart. Very similar to a lot of stuff we dealt with in Stormblood. So this was one of the things we made assignments for earlier. We put 2 people in each quadrant in the intercardinal directions and just made sure they didn't stand next to each other and didn't stand too close to Eden itself. And with that, it's very simple. It's how it would look if you actually organized it in normal mode. And then everyone just converges to make sure that we're all together for AoE heals. Now, this is the first real mechanic that got people, and will probably get people in the Party Finder, is Dimensional Shift, which is quite a bit different in Savage. Both the times you'll see it, as opposed to the way you did it in normal. It does do a bunch of damage, so make sure everyone's healed up, mitigated for this Dimensional Shift. As you can see, it does quite a bit of damage. Now, Paradise Lost is actually going to be targeting the 4 players furthest away from Eden with 5 AoEs that will track them one by one. So you're going to see me go off away from the group and kind of bait my own circles. I've seen groups doing this a bunch of different ways. I've seen groups like stack up under the back of the boss and then kite around the boss, very similar to kind of Omega's Pantocrator, if you guys were around for that. But we actually just had ranged players go away and just try to be the ones responsible for baiting the circles. You're going to see me do that right here, where I go a little bit further out. You can see that we didn't really do it too much this run, so we do have melees that are actually dealing with it as well. But it's actually really nice if you have ranged players who, I guess, aren't too hurt by the movement. Like machinists, dancers, or anyone with a lot of instant cast available at the time, actually taking these and baiting them away from the group, because it opens up the center of the room for the melees to just not have to worry about it. So they can focus on their DPS, focus on their uptime, and then do the mechanic that's actually coming next, which is called Pure Beam. Now, each of those circles in the center of the room, those orbs, is going to fire 1 laser at the party member that is nearest to it when Pure Beam actually finishes casting. So essentially, you want to make sure that no beam gets aimed through 2 players. Now, the way we're doing this is just the way we're doing it day 1. I'm sure there's an optimized way to keep melee on the boss 100% of the time and make sure that they still aim a laser that doesn't actually kill people by aiming it between where 2 other people would be. If you're a melee and you have that position, stick to it. Make sure you tell your other party finders for it. But otherwise, we essentially just tried to have all these lasers aimed towards the outside of the room. So you can see that it looks like that because we're all standing right next to one and we're all facing it towards the outside. This is definitely the safest way to go about doing this with nobody killing each other versus going for an uptime strat. So that's what I would recommend doing. We did have one person die that got hit by 2 of the circles, it looked like. Seeing as they had 2 vuln stacks right there, and then they were just missing some health because of that, so they just died to that. Otherwise, we were doing the mechanic properly. If anyone gets hit by 2 lasers, though, they're dead. The lasers give magic vuln, and the second hit will do an unsurvivable amount of damage. After that, Eden will warp away, do pure light, get behind Eden. Very simple. Back to the center of the room, dimensional shift, more room wide from that, and then Frigor Maximus for the ad phase. So it's paced very similarly to the way normal mode was. It's just there's less AoE markers available. The actual dimensional shift requires a little bit more coordination and positioning, and there's actually quite a bit more room wide damage that's happening here. Frigor Maximus also does a ton of damage to everybody here. But other than that, this ad phase is very, very similar to the way it was in normal mode. You still have to kill both of the ads relatively quickly, or they will cast Unto Dust and wipe the party. Their initial landing still does proximity damage, and you still have about 45 seconds for this ad phase, or it's going to be a wipe. Now, on top of that, the Guardians of Paradise can actually be grouped up and AoE'd if you have anyone whose AoE is better at 2 targets, or have anyone that has any sort of skill like a summoner wishing to bane onto both targets, or any sort of ground effects like Salted Earth. Anything that can help by grouping them up and keeping them faced away, which you'll see us do right here, is very, very useful for passing the DPS check, because much to our surprise, they don't tether together by being next to each other. I was very surprised to see this. Now, they do have one new mechanic that your tanks or your ranged physical DPS can be responsible for dealing with, and it's just going to be the very first mana burst that they actually use, or mana boost, I should say, will actually give them a massive damage boost, as the name would apply. If they finish casting this, when they go to use the Tank Buster and Mana Burst, it is going to be an insane amount of damage, and you're not going to want to have to deal with that. So have either your tanks or your ranged physical DPS silence or interrupt Mana Boost from both of them, and the rest of the phase actually is pretty much the same as you would expect. Make sure they're both faced away too, because they do have cleaves. As you can see, we got a little bit separated right here because a tank didn't have tank stance on. Whatever, it's recovered. Mana Burst is just room-wide damage to make sure to mitigate that. So it goes Mana Boost, then Tank Buster, Mana Burst, Tank Buster, Mana Burst, Tank Buster, Unto Dust. So you can see here as a dancer, you know, my AoE is very, very effective on 2 targets. They're not as close together as I would like for Fan Dance 3, but other than that, it's a very simple DPS check to make as long as people just focus on taking them out. And as you can see, we also killed Guardian of Paradise 1 at a very different time than Guardian of Paradise 2. The DPS check for Unto Dust is essentially just for the entirety of the phase. Killing them at separate times isn't too bad. However, I don't know what would happen if you killed one at 100% to 0 and then went to the other one. There may be an effect that's triggered by doing it like that off pace that I'm unaware of. So if there is, be sure to put it in the comment section of the YouTube video below. Other than that, you do still have to watch Eternal Breath, so you will get all that cooldown reset. There's no active time event or anything added in here, but it still is awesome to watch as it ever was. Gives you a little bit of time to take a break, take a sip of water, you know, go make a sandwich, pay your bills, whatever it is you got to do while you're waiting for Eternal Breath. As much as I love the animation, there's nothing else to explain here, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. It does do a bunch of damage, though, so make sure people are healed up and taken care of before Eternal Breath actually does its damage. Now, for the second phase, Eden Prime does a massive amount of changes for the next 15 to 20% of the boss's health, and that is going to be noticed by Paradise Regain. So this is going to take all of the Vice and Virtue abilities from the first phase, as well as Dimensional Shift, and make them entirely different for the next cast. So you'll see what we're going to do right here is for the lasers, so these are the tank lasers from the earlier phase. However, these tank lasers actually need to be intercepted by other players. Now, I will be honest, we don't know if it's entirely split damage or if it's damage that only needs to be mitigated with one extra person. So we had 2 groups of 4 stacked up. But more importantly, somebody needs to take the initial hit for this other than the main tank. The first person hit by this Vice and Virtue from each of these lasers will actually be will actually give physical vulnerability up, and you don't want that on your tanks. It's because Spear of Paradise is going to happen a little bit later. The auto attacks are going to be lethal. It's just not going to be good. So you'll see right here, we stand slightly in front. We have 2 groups of 4. We stack them up, and we make sure the tank is not the first person hit by that. Simple enough. That's all you're going to need to do. Just make 2 groups of 4 and split the damage, and you should be fine. Now, the next mechanic is actually the main thing we labeled A, B, C, and D for, and it's Vice and Virtue pairs. So now you're going to get the Vice and Virtue that was a puddle for each DPS before. Instead, now what it is it's a split damage AoE that you need to split just between 2 people. You have to do it that way because you can't have the 4 people splitting with each other, and you only have one extra person to split it with for each person as well. It does about 120,000 damage before the split. So usually, you know, before mitigation and stuff, about 60,000 damage to each person. So keep that in mind for people's health and whatnot. Now, on top of that, we actually did our pairings here, the same assignments we did for Delta Attack earlier. So we assigned 2 people to each quadrant for Delta Attack. We made sure that was each one DPS in each quadrant, and 1 tank and 1 healer joining them in each. All we did was do that and then use those same assignments for this later in the fight. So very simple. You'll see that when Vice and Virtue finishes casting, we just take a little bit of damage and it's all done. Now, for the next part, there's actually a Delta Attack, and I personally find this Delta Attack even easier than the other Delta Attack. So this Delta Attack is entirely inversed from what it was the first time. So for the ice component, you actually need to be close to Eden Prime in order to survive it. The fire 3s that you were spreading out before now need to be stacked up And the Thunder 3 that comes out, instead of being a cross AoE that hits, you know, all 4 cardinal directions, it's 2 tank busters that just need to be eaten at the same time. So what we just had is we had all 6 of the non-tanks stacked behind the boss, you know, stay relatively close as to be within the Blizzard 3, within the area of safety for Blizzard 3. And we had both tanks separate like they would for the lasers in the first phase. And when it finishes casting, it just looks nice and pretty and no one's dead. So you can see right there. That's it. And it's actually a very forgiving size on the AoE for Blizzard 3. Now, there is one more Vice and Virtue that you need to do that's inversed from its function prior. And we did this in what is probably considered a not pug-friendly way of doing it. So our healers are going to get 2 of those AoEs that they got before. You know, the prey marker that they passed all the way back in like the first minute. For reference, I suppose we could go back. It's this mechanic right here that is changed this time, where our healers gave that stack to the tank, and it just gave them a bleed. What it actually does this time is it gives a healing reduction, a physical vulnerability up, and a poison effect. So if you were to give this to a non-tank, you'd only have to deal with the poison. If the healer were to take it, they do less healing for the duration, and if a tank takes it, they essentially become a paper towel in terms of their durability for the remainder of it. We decided to go with the tank route on this one. So we had the healers very sloppily, because we didn't really organize it well. We had them very sloppily pass it to the tanks, as you can see right here. And then we had the tanks use their tank invulnerability skills for the Spear of Paradise that comes out. Well, we wanted them to use it, but one of them popped their home gang for the actual Vice and Virtue instead of the Spear of Paradise. So we are going to have a tank who actually dies to the Spear of Paradise. But the other one ends up perfectly fine because he has Hallowed Ground. You should have probably just had them not tank swap and just had him Hallowed Ground with both hits. So that's what we decided to do for that. We had our healers give the debuff to the tanks, have them both use tank and vulnerability skills for the Spear of Paradise. Realistically, you could just leave it all on one because they already have the physical vuln up, but we just did it like a tank swap like normal from before and had them both use it. Nothing too major. And at this point, you've almost seen all the new mechanics for Eden Prime, but there's one big one that still confuses people in the Party Finder, and that is Dimensional Shift number 2 and on. All your dimensional shifts from now on will look like this and not like the original one. And it seems like a lot's going on here, but it's actually very, very simple. So, like with the first dimensional shift, these orbs are going to fire an attack at the person nearest to them. So the target for this is entirely proximity based. After they pick a target, you're going to see right here. I'll let it go off before I talk about the rest of the phase. You can see it fires a set of 3 lasers at the person who is nearest. Now, on top of that, the AoE is going to rotate. So your goal is to bait these AoEs in such a way that they rotate away from the center of the room and leave everyone completely safe without needing to dodge a single one. So, for example, with this one, you can see that this one was going to be rotating clockwise. So, from the center of the room, I looked at this. Let's go back to the beginning of the dimensional shift. From the center of the room, I looked at the orb and saw that it was going to be going clockwise. I immediately went to the left side to bait it. So now the AoE is going to rotate just towards the north side of the room. If it had been counterclockwise, I would have known to have gone to the other side of it, so that way it could still rotate towards the north of the room. And we just assigned 4 people to be responsible for baiting these circles and keeping them away from the group. On top of that, this whole time, you need to kill these 4 arcane spheres before a meteor hits the ground. They have very low health and actually are pretty safe to DPS for the most part, as long as you're not going to ruin the baits from the person who's actually responsible for the meteor. You can see there's someone right there next to me DPSing the one right next to me, but he's not the closest person, so we don't have that much to worry about. If you do it all perfectly while DPSing these spheres, you'll look at, we all are in the center of the room, except for the one person who was a little late, and they all just rotate in a super safe way away from the rest of the room. There's even a bunch of leeway for you to aim those at a slightly different direction. Like if I go back to that, if I actually even aimed it a little bit more to the north, everyone would still be safe, but this for me was probably the safest bet. It'd probably be a little bit better though, in hindsight, looking at this, to move it just a little bit, move it to like the, so right now I'm at like the 9 o'clock of the orb, move it more to like the 10:30. And that would probably be a little bit safer for people who are on the sides, but it leaves the center of the room completely safe. So this absolutely works as long as you make sure to actually get, dodge it and get to the safe zone after the fact. You just got to run straight for the center of the room. Yeah, for the people on the side, so you see how it clipped both the healers who were responsible for that? If we had aimed it a little bit off, or if they had just bolted for the middle of the room without being so concerned about the direction the AoEs were facing, then it would have been a little bit safer for them too. They would have had a clear line right from where they were baiting right to the center. So in hindsight, I'd probably adjust that positioning that we used there to make it a little bit more friendly for the group. So yeah, even I get to learn things when I do these style of videos. After you kill all 4 of the meteors and that, it's on to pure light. And luckily, after this, you've pretty much seen, there's only really one thing left to talk about at this point in the fight. And it's because it's only slightly different from the way it was the first time you did it. Dimensional shift, damage, pure light, get behind. But all the vice and virtues are actually back to being the normal ones at this point. So this Eden's gravity is the same, but now the puddles are back to the same. The lasers are back to just being tank lasers. And you're essentially just doing phase 1 of the fight again. Eventually, if you take too long, Eden Prime will use Paradise Regained again, but not until after another one of those dimensional shifts. And the Eden's flare there doesn't make any sense to me. It's like an Eden's gravity into an Eden's flare. Just so, I guess it's just so you can see that it's the phases the way it was before. I don't really know what the point of that Eden's flare is. It just feels really out of place. But you can see, double tank laser, Spear of Paradise. It's the same as the phase 1 rotation. Or it's not entirely the same, but it's the vice and virtues are the same as their phase 1 iterations. It's the same as the phase 1 delta attack as well, so everyone just has to get to their little quadrants. Now this was slightly different because there's actually puddles on the ground during this delta attack. We had to make sure to bait these puddles in a way that the people doing delta attack weren't, you know, screwed. So I'd highly recommend just getting used to dropping those puddles in cardinal directions, because that's not going to be a place anyone can go during the second delta attack anyway. See, I dropped mine north. We have one that's dropped east, west, and south. That way there's plenty of open space for everybody. Just a good habit to be in the early phase 2 instead of just YOLO dropping a puddle somewhere and then maybe also just YOLO dropping a puddle a little bit later on. These are those healer tellers that we again did very, very sloppily. There's a much safer way to do that when you know those puddles are coming. The healers can legit just go stand on the tank positions and just let it pass and then move away. Or the tanks can come get them from the healers. You know, it's better than having our healers do a lap around the group because we just stood in their way the entire time. And then this dimensional, this is exactly the same. We actually screwed this one up a little bit more. I think somebody misbaits it and it goes not really through the center, but I think I get killed here. Well, I guess it's kind of through the center. Yeah, see, I made the mistake of trying to stand in between them, but then I got clipped by it twice, so we got killed. Yeah, we had a few deaths there to that one because one was misaimed, but not the end of the world. It still ends up being the run where we actually kill it. And this is where, after the dimensional shift, I think it was Eden's Gravity, Eden's Flare, and then Paradise Regained. So now, if Eden doesn't have that much time left before Enrage, I'd like to imagine at this point, but we still had to treat these like their normal, like their Paradise Regained version, so we had to block for the tanks again. So if you do make it this far, just keep in mind it's a repeat of the start of Phase 2, where it's going to be the 2 Vice and Virtues with the split lasers, it's going to be the pairings, and then it's going to continue on from there. We didn't even get to use the LB3. Mine's not even going to deal damage here. But at that point, you've seen the entire fight. It's definitely a fight that has a lot of different strategies that could work for a lot of positioning at certain points between the ads that I just pulled up here and the slight adjustments I mentioned to the rotations during Dimensional Shift. But yeah, hopefully this is just of some help to people. Again, apologies that it's not really in a very formal guide setting, just because, again, I consider this footage unusable, and I'm also doing massive stream hours while Savage Prog is actually going on. So it's just rough for me to get around to doing the proper stuff like I'd definitely like to be doing. But hopefully you understand that. If you'd like a little bit more into the how we actually recognize mechanics like this, I am planning a video along those lines where we kind of break down a lot of these similar fights. But we break them down from a perspective of how did we figure this out day one? How can you go into a party finder, fresh progression, a fight you've never seen before, and recognize a mechanic for what it is the first time you actually see it? So thank you for watching this little walkthrough of Eden Prime Savage. Oh, and one other thing I guess I should really mention that was very, very useful that we noticed is that Eden Prime Savage actually had 3 drops. There was an earring coffer, a ring coffer, and a bracelet coffer. From what I understand, there are other coffers that can drop here as well. Any of the accessory-related coffers can drop, and there's up to 3 of them. With these coffers, it's very similar to the coffers you got throughout the main scenario. Whoever wins the roll on these, they can use the coffer in a city like Yulmore, Crystarium, city-states, and it will actually become like an earring, for example, that I have hovered over here. It'd be like I'm a dancer, so if I use that coffer in town, to become an earring of aiming. So it definitely allows you to basically, there's never loot that's wasted, but it's gonna make for pug groups a little bit rougher, because it means everyone's going to be rolling against you on every piece, as long as it's a piece that they actually want. Especially considering the way that Savage Mode loot actually works. I think it's going to be a little bit of a headache for pug groups, but hopefully the pros outweigh the cons when it comes to this one in the long run. So anyway, I am going to now get to doing the same style of video for Voidwalker, which I think is a much bigger problem in the Party Finder than Eden Prime Savages. So thank you for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for a very similar style video for Voidwalker or E2 Savage. Thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.